Our edition of Fine Print with the protests that have taken over the world. People are out on the streets in over 80 cities protesting against the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini. Amini had died in police custody in Iran. Her crime? Not wearing a hijab properly. Iranians have taken to the streets for the 10th consecutive night as the West Asian nation deals with its largest protests in years. But it is not just Iran that is protesting against Amini's death. Protesters have taken to the streets across the world. From London to Paris, Iran's anti-hijab protests have gone global. In West Asia itself, there were protests in neighboring Iraq, Turkey and Syria. Protesters rallied outside the United Nations consulate in Iraq's Kurdish region, holding up posters and photographs of Mahsa Amini. Demonstrators chanted "Women, Life and Freedom" as women took to the streets calling for justice. In Syria too, the scenes were similar. Hundreds of women protested in the Kurdish-controlled North Syria. Some cut their hair, others burned their headscarves.
We, women of Rojava and northeastern Syria, protest today to condemn the killing of martyr Mahsa Amini from Saqqez city in Iran. We back the peaceful Iranian protest and we hope that states and organizations defend women's rights.
Turkey too witnessed similar protests in the last few days. The protests come even as Iran denies any role in Mahsa Amini's death. But not just West Asia. The protests have spread to Europe too. In London, clashes erupted outside the Iranian embassy. Protesters clashed with security forces as riot police were deployed to the scene of the clashes. In Paris, French police used tear gas to prevent the protests. This as hundreds of people were marching to Iran's embassy in Paris. The police first blocked the path of the protesters, then they used tear gas to disperse them. In Greece, Iranian women cut off their hair and burned their hijabs, with many of them chanting "Mad, mad dictator." Men too joined women in the protests, shaving off their hair. And in New York, public anger escalated over Amini's death as protesters called for the prosecution of President Ibrahim Raisi. Iran has denounced the global anti-hijab protests, criticizing Washington's support for so-called rioters. Tehran has also slammed the British and Norwegian ambassadors over what it called interference and hostile media coverage.
Down with Raisi! Down with Khamenei! Down with Raisi! Tutan peşmeşe, ahun bayat koşmeşe. Khamenei, down with Raisi!
And for more on this, we have with us Anne-Elisabeth Moutet from Paris. Anne-Elisabeth Moutet is a journalist and also a political commentator. Anne-Elisabeth, welcome to the program. These protests are seemingly turning out to be revolutionary. What do you say about, the globe coming around and supporting Iran?
Supporting the women of Iran, I should say, not Iran itself. But I think it's a combination of several things. First of all, we have known for years, decades, that the Iranian regime is now far beyond whatever human rights abuses were approached to the old Shah, and especially in the treatment of women, and especially in the subjugation of women. Iranians know also that this is a deeply corrupt regime, and the death of two women essentially beaten to death Mahini, but another one as well, is now sort of bringing them to the boil. In France, there's an added motive for anger, which is the fact that Emmanuel Macron, our president, met President Ibrahim Raisi and shook his hand at the National Assembly of the United Nations, with the hopes that if he has a sort of diplomacy with him, they can restore the JCPOA, the nuclear accord that essentially frames but does not forbid the nuclear production by Iran. And there's a feeling that this is outrageous. And then once again, President Macron is trying the kind of talk diplomacy that worked so well with Vladimir Putin to stop him invading Ukraine. So we have a French political contact, we have a world political contact and context, and we also have the anger of women and many men at the treatment meted out by the dictatorship in Iran.
Anne-Elizabeth, do you think Iran will give in to this protests, and will we see some sort of reforms in the police, you think?
They're not looking like they're going to, first of all, because they're a dictatorial regime and they don't give in to protests, being afraid that this might just escalate to more protest. And there's plenty to protest about in Iran. Human rights in general are being abused in Iran. But I also think that this might be seen as a moment to push by various oppositions in Iranian oppositions, because the regime is not doing very well, and now would be the time, especially with the current reach of the Iranians in the region, in the Middle East, but also in Iran. You have in Ukraine, the Iranians have used drones. I mean, the Russians have used Iranian drones to bomb the city of Odessa yesterday and the day before. So there's a terrorist sponsor state. We know very well that they are behind Hezbollah in Lebanon, for instance. There's a terrorist sponsor state, and there's a feeling that now is the moment to push.
Finally, Anne-Elizabeth, if the Iranian government or the regime doesn't care, what happens next then?
I think they believe that they can still hold the population subject. They have about 20% supporters. They have the very well-trained Revolutionary Guards, and they hope that they can still go on as was. And it's really a question of this kind of policy has worked, unfortunately, many times for dictatorships until it doesn't.
Anne-Elizabeth Motet, thank you very much for talking to us and for making time for WION.
Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.